Okay, so actually this talk follows nicely from the previous talk, because the previous talk really looked at consensus from a nice theoretical perspective, but now we're going to actually look at consensus from a kind of engineering perspective and all the challenges in scaling and all that stuff once you build real systems. So my talk has two parts. The first part is going to look at consensus protocols and how you can actually build new variants of consensus protocols to be highly performant and implementable and efficient. And the second part will look at actually how you can build larger scale distributed systems that have a very nice scalability property, which is that basically they can scale infinitely. The more machines you put into them, the more transactions you can process, and yet you don't lose the nice kind of robustness and verifiability properties that blockchains offer us. Now, currently, as we will see, I'm actually working at my own startup called Chainsapce. However, this is going to be a research talk, which means that basically I'm going to present just research results, research ideas, etc. There will be no marketing. You will be happy to hear. But most importantly, don't take anything I say as somehow, a roadmap to what my company is going to do or some kind of promise that we will deliver it. Don't invest in the company on the basis of anything I will present here. I have to say that just in case any of you are investing in cryptocurrencies, see my talk and kind of get influenced to invest in us and then complain to me that we're not doing exactly what is described here down the line. Okay, so I am George Danezis. My passion in research really has to do with decentralization and privacy. And the two are kind of related. Decentralization really rebalances the power from having very few entities in the world that have a lot of control over people's life, and this is related to my interest around blockchains. And privacy, of course, also through the virtue of having more control over your private data or hiding some data from other powerful entities also allows you to have more control over your life. So in fact, despite Reza's warranted cynicism, the two aspects of my research life, namely blockchains and privacy, are more related than unrelated than you may think. At the same time, I am a co-founder at Chainsapce.io, which commercializes some of the ideas I'll talk about. I won't talk about the company anymore. And before that, and still today, I'm also a professor of security and privacy engineering at UCL in London. And before that, I was at Microsoft Research, KU Leuven, and Cambridge. Now, I said I won't advertise my company. However, I will advertise that UCL is opening positions both for faculty, postdocs, and PhD students in the next few years in security. So if you're looking for a job at any level of your career, please consider sending me an email and applying for some of those. So, stay in touch. So the two topics I will present today have papers associated with them. One of them was accepted. This is the Chainsapce paper. The other one, the Blockmania paper, has not been accepted, but eventually it will at some point when we have more time to make it prepare. So if you want to follow up on this talk and look at any of the details, please look at the papers. I will also present some things that we haven't published yet, but I'm actually believing in being quite a giving person. So, why not talk about things that are in the pipeline? So I'll try to talk about some of those at the end. Okay, so what is going to be covered in this talk? Let's think a little bit about the outline. So the first part is going to cover how do we go about building reliable distributed systems, right? I mean, this seems to be like an important skill to have, and we actually know a lot about how to build reliable distributed systems, but it's a little bit of a black art still, I feel. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And as part of how to build reliable distributed systems and how to do that, we're going to discuss a little bit about what is consensus and what is the role of consensus in that context of building reliable distributed systems. Then we will look at a variant of practical Byzantine fault tolerance, which is a particular consensus protocol proposed in the end of the 90s. And we're going to actually look at this algorithm and try to strip it away to its bare minimum Okay, understand a little bit, get a bit of an insight about how it works. It's notoriously opaque, actually. Most people are very scared of looking inside it, but we'll try to actually look inside it and try to understand a little bit why it works. And then we're going to look at how to efficiently implement it. And I will try to give you some insights, particularly that we have acquired as part of our commercial activities. And then we'll just put the question of consensus aside in building distributed systems. We'll take it as a given that we can have consensus, and Byzantine consensus specifically. And then we'll say, OK, how do we go from just having a consensus algorithm to actually building systems that really can scale to a global planetary scale, right? Because just consensus, as we will see, might not actually get us there. And this is where we will start talking about Chainsapce and how to create these super scalable distributed platforms. Any questions so far about what we're going to look at and why? So consensus first, then beyond consensus for building blockchains. Questions? No? OK, let's go right in. Should I talk until 6? Is that the deal? That's the deal. OK. OK, so first of all, let me motivate why we care about consensus protocols. And really, why am I here and why previously speaker was there as well. So consensus protocols have been studied since the 1980s. Okay, so they're a very old thing by the standards of computer science. And as the previous speaker suggested, some of those are used in production, in particularly the kind of chubby distributed system run locks within Google uses a variant of consensus protocols called Paxos. But the more kind of security-related variants were considered a bit exotic for many years. And many people have proposed some of these algorithms, but basically no one cared for a very long time. And then what happened was that in 2008, Bitcoin came out. And Bitcoin, if you really look at it, proposes a weird variant of a consensus algorithm. It's a consensus algorithm that allows a big open community of nodes to kind of agree on a sequence of transactions that represent some value system. Okay? And we call that Nakamoto consensus. There is a huge argument within the community of, is that really a consensus algorithm? Is it not a consensus algorithm? I'm not going to take any position on that. It is what it is. Ethereum uses it. That extends Bitcoin, if you want, into the realm of having generic smart contracts and user-defined contracts that run on these blockchains. And suddenly, consensus became very popular in the form of this Nakamoto proof-of-work consensus. Now, the Nakamoto consensus on which Bitcoin and Ethereum are based has a huge advantage, which is that as an algorithm and as a distributed system, it allows an open membership. So nodes can come in, nodes can come out, and the whole thing still works and produces a kind of common view of events that have happened in the system. However, it actually has also some negative aspects to it, right? And one negative aspect to it is what is called weak finality, or eventual finality. This means that at any point, when you're within Bitcoin or the Ethereum world, you're not quite sure if the version of events that you have kind of accepted so far will be the final version of events. So it might be the case that you're a participant within the Bitcoin system or the Ethereum system. You see a transaction within a block that you kind of have accepted as being currently valid, but then a little bit later, a few minutes later, something else happens in the system, and you realize that that transaction, in fact, will not go through, and something else will happen instead. That is not a very nice property for a distributed system. Because what does it mean? It means that effectively, as a merchant, you think that someone paid you some money. So you give them, for example, the goods over the counter, and then 5 to 10 to 20 minutes later, you realize, whoops, actually, this version of events didn't actually happen, and something else happened. So weak finality in distributed systems is not a very nice property to have. You want, once you know that something has happened, to make sure that this does not change, okay? The second problem that Nakamoto consensus has is related to its association with proof of work, where you have to actually hash and hit a particular target, and then share basically blocks that hash to a particular target in order for everyone to accept them as part of a long chain. And that is energy hungry, and it burns basically the atmosphere and all that stuff. It's not good. So as a result of all this, namely the fact that Bitcoin and Ethereum became popular, but that the core of the consensus algorithm they use has some limitations, there was a renewed interest in more traditional forms of consensus, and in particular Byzantine consensus. And this is really the path that I personally took in getting more interested in these protocols. I was not particularly curious about those protocols before. I started reading Byzantine fault-tolerant papers in the end of the 90s and the beginning of 2000s, and I found them awfully complicated and a bit opaque, and I couldn't really see the point. It is only because of the interest around blockchains and distributed ledgers and open systems that I started getting interested in that, and I revisited this topic. So, what is a consensus algorithm? Let's actually start from the very basics. Of course, the previous speaker has covered a lot of that, but let me just not break my flow and just cover it again. So, a consensus algorithm is, first of all, a distributed algorithm. Okay, it is a protocol that runs amongst a set of nodes. And for the sake of this conversation today, let's imagine that it is a closed set. All the nodes know all the other nodes that are meant to be in that set of nodes that run a consensus algorithm. Now, that set of nodes that run the consensus algorithm may be subject to failures. So some of the nodes within that set may actually fail. Okay? And despite those failures, the nodes that haven't failed, presumably, have to actually reach a joint decision. So imagine if, in this context here, we all want to reach a joint decision about which movie we're going to go to. Are we going to see Spider-Man, or are we going to see Superman, or something like that? So at the end of the day, we all want to turn up in the same place, so we want to reach a joint decision. Now, of course, some of us may just fall asleep or fail in other ways and will not turn up anywhere, or will be malicious and just do crazy stuff, and we have no control over that. But we want to make sure that all those that are not malicious and have not crashed end up in the same movie. Okay? And that property that we all end up in the same movie is called agreement. Okay? All the honest nodes, or all the nodes that have not failed, need to reach a common decision. That's safety. The second property is liveness. We want to eventually all make a decision, and once we make that decision, once each individual of us makes that decision, we want that decision to be kind of final. Okay? We don't want to think that we reached the decision and start, going towards Spider-Man, and then when you're outside the door of the Spider-Man movie, you realize that actually everybody else is somewhere else. Okay? That is not something we want. And more seriously, when we deal with financial systems or computing systems, we don't want to think that some money has gone somewhere or has arrived to us, shipping goods or taking action in the real world, and then suddenly realizing this is not the case. Okay? So liveness means that eventually all the nodes will reach a decision, and finality says that basically that decision will not be revocated down the line. Now, there is some side conditions as well that I never really paid too much attention to that are necessary to make sure that the algorithm is not totally trivial. One of those side conditions, for example, is that the decision we reach has to have been proposed by at least an honest node in the set. Okay? Because otherwise, you end up having weird, really trivial protocols to do consensus. So imagine the case where you have a protocol to decide which movie we're going to go to all together. Here, well, there is a very simple protocol that decides always Gone with the Wind. No matter what set of people we have here, no matter what their preferences are, no matter what is the cool movie these days, no matter if any of us wants to actually go and see Gone with the Wind, the algorithm always outputs Gone with the Wind, so we will always basically go there. Okay? That is a silly and trivial protocol. No one wants to have a consensus protocol that just outputs a constant forever. Okay, so we have to kind of put those side conditions, but I'm not going to deal with those side conditions in this today. Okay, so consensus protocols ensure that a joint set of nodes reach a decision or a sequence of decisions. Here we're going to actually look at a variant that just reaches one decision and then discuss how actually we end up with a sequence of decisions. Now, why are consensus algorithms, from a systems perspective, so important when it comes to building reliable distributed systems? Okay, this is often when we talk about consensus algorithms, the kind of hidden thing, the thing that we don't really talk about. Why are they so important? And they're so important because in the end of the 1980s, Fred Schneider and others really presented what is known today as the state machine replication paradigm for building reliable distributed systems. And what is the state machine paradigm? It says the following. Imagine we want to build a reliable distributed system to do a particular job, okay, a computing job, presumably, okay? Now, we could throw ourselves on this task in a kind of ad hoc way, okay? And, you know, we may find some tricks for building a reliable distributed system that tolerates failures in order to build this particular job. But most likely we will get it wrong. Instead, Fred Schneider and others said we should apply the following paradigm. What we should do is we should take the description of this job and really encode it as a state machine. And at the end of the day, any kind of computer program that takes some input and changes state can be encoded as a state machine. It has an initial state, it receives a command that makes it move to different states, and therefore any kind of computing job could be described as a state machine. Okay, so the idea is that we take the job we want to do and we encode it as a state machine. Now that state machine has to be deterministic, so given a command and a particular state, it goes to a particular other state, okay? Now let's take an example of a bank. So a bank, as its state, has a certain number of accounts and a certain amount of money or value associated with those accounts. And there is one type of transaction that it can deal from that state, which is transfer from a particular account to another account a particular amount of money, okay? So if a bank is this collection of accounts and the values associated with them, it receives basically a command that says move some money from one account to the other account. It checks that that money is sufficient, that the accounts exist, and all the side conditions. If it is not a valid transaction, it just rejects it and doesn't change the state. If it is valid, it moves to a new state where some money was taken from one account and moved to the other account. So you can see that we can implement a kind of simple bank as a state machine. And we can actually implement most of other computing protocols, actually all of them, pretty much as a state machine. So then what you do, in order to build a reliable system that implements this functionality, is the following. As a first step, you basically get a set of nodes, okay, and you make them run a consensus protocol amongst each other, okay? And then what happens is that transactions come to these consensus protocol, these nodes running the consensus protocol, and the job of the consensus protocol is to create a common ordering amongst all these nodes of the sequence of transactions that they will all accept as the canonical sequence. So as we said, a consensus protocol ensures that that set of nodes here, those replicas now as we will call them, all end up with the same decisions. So those replicas say, what should we do as the first action? They all run the consensus protocol, and they all come together to an agreement about the first action they should run, the first transaction. Then they say, what should we do as a second action? Then they jointly basically run the consensus protocol and decide a second action, and so on and so forth. So by actually having access to consensus protocols, we can come all to a determination about a sequence of actions that at least all the honest, non-crashing nodes will agree on. And then what you do once you actually have a common sequence of actions, or commands if you want, is you start from an initial state that everybody agrees on. So for example, in the bank it might be the case that one account has all the money, no account, other account exists. And then what you do is you feed in each of the replicas separately now that common set of commands, and they each start from an initial state, and keep moving in the same sequence to subsequent states, making sure that despite any failures or anything like that, they keep in lockstep, step after step after step, the same state. Now, if some of them fail, that's okay, because the other ones will basically replicate the exact state and keep running. And there are protocols for recovering and resynchronizing state. And now, as a result of that, depending on the quality and the properties of your consensus algorithm, you can tolerate different types of failures, different types of nodes that fail, different ways in which they can fail, etc. But you don't have to worry about changing pretty much anything else, okay? Just the fact that you have a common sequence of commands and an agreed initial state and some rules for actually running this state machine allows you to just basically do robust replicated computation, which is pretty awesome. It turns out that you can actually do that in a pretty generic way. And in fact, this is what Insight Ethereum kind of reinvented in order to build smart contract platforms. Yes? Distributed databases, it depends how you distribute the database. If you distribute the database by replication, namely you have many databases that replicate, you can use that paradigm. You can. If you distribute the database by partitioning, for example, you have table one, well, table about, inventory in one database, table about, HR in another, then no, because that's not replication. Databases have not traditionally used this paradigm. Huh? Yeah, and why is that? Because traditionally databases have not been considered first in a Byzantine setting. That's one question. And secondly, why are databases not using Paxos usually? Any answer to that? Anyone else knows?
So there is work in adding scalable log.
Yes.
Underneath database, there is work from Danezis
Yes.
and the like.
And the VMware people nowadays, yeah.
VMware people
Yeah.
actually they try to build this scalable log underneath and they run a database on top. And a scalable log is basically, if you look at that abstraction is a log abstraction.
That's the log,
That's
to
the
be
log.
exact.
It's action 1, action 2. And in fact, you don't even need to fill first action 1, then action 2, then action 3, then action 4. You can actually fill each of the slots independently as long as you don't proceed executing action I until you have executed all the actions up to action I.
That's correct. But why are traditional distributed databases not using that? Any insight?
Yeah, because it's slower.
Yeah.
So for efficiency reasons, you can basically trade off these very strong consistency properties to much better.
Yeah. Please.
They use sort of primary backup,
Exactly. So they use a primary and then a set of backups. But the question is, how do they decide how to hot swap, etc., without this, right?
So they still use processes for editing the primary.
I see, and that's it, right? And this is what Chubby does. It just basically allows you to elect the leader, and then they take over, right? Yeah. Anyway, a variety of views about this, all of which are correct. Okay, so bottom line is, the reason why we care about consensus algorithms is that if you have a consensus algorithm, you can create this log that everybody shares, everybody at least that is live or honest shares, and then you can drive basically any kind of distributed computation in a way that all the honest and live nodes will correctly replicate the state of the system, and when they suffer failures or whatever, will not get desynchronized or get confused about what the state of the system is. Okay, now there are many different flavors of consensus protocols depending on the kind of network model they use, the failure model, and also a little bit about who initiates decisions. So the network model, and again the previous speaker has covered some of the basics of that, really is divided between synchronous networking and asynchronous networking, and then there is something in the middle which we will look at. In a synchronous network, we assume that nodes know a bound within which all messages from an honest node to another honest node or from a live node to another live node will arrive. So as a result of that, if I know that someone is meant to send me a message and I haven't heard within that specific time from them, I can assume that they are basically, that they have failed, okay? And that's it. So I can just proceed after that time and say, okay, because I haven't heard from you, you must be dead, and therefore now I can proceed on the basis that you're dead. Okay. In an asynchronous network, there is no such bound, okay? It may be the case that a message is delayed for an arbitrary amount of time, okay? And there is no bound about this that is meaningfully known to the honest nodes. Now, all messages need to be delivered eventually from honest nodes to honest nodes by the network, but that may take actually pretty much for a long, long time, longer than you actually care about, okay? This is a pretty harsh model. I mean, it is true to say that real networks are not synchronous, for sure. Sometimes there are network splits on the internet, sometimes routers burn and might actually take a day to connect, a particular island to the network, etc. That happens. But the idea that, you might wait for a year to a message to arrive, and, after a year and a day, you will still be sitting there waiting instead of actually having taken a plane and carried the message by hand is also a little bit extreme. However, it's a useful abstraction. And then there is an abstraction in the middle, which we will use actually in the protocols we build, which is called partial synchrony. And that means the following. It means that the network may be in a condition of asynchrony for a long time, but eventually there will be a period of synchrony. And this really kind of encapsulates and captures the fact that for a long time, nodes may not know effectively what the bound on the delay is. Okay, so I may say, okay, I'm going to use the internet. The internet is usually fast, so I will assume that messages from honest nodes arrive within 4 seconds. But I'm on a bad day, and there was splits or whatever, something like that. And as a result, the messages don't arrive within 4 seconds. So what is the engineering approach to dealing with that? Well, I increase my timeout. I'm saying, well, let's see, will the messages arrive within 8 seconds? Will they arrive within 16 seconds? Will they arrive within 32 seconds? Will they arrive within a minute? Okay? And eventually, just by increasing and becoming more and more and more tolerant on the delay, you assume the network will have eventually all honest nodes from honest participants to, all honest messages from honest participants to other honest participants will arrive within that time window, okay? And that's what partial synchrony really, as an abstraction, is meant to kind of capture. That, by becoming more and more tolerant, eventually we will just hit the delay that, the network has. Okay, so this is the network model that a consensus algorithm tolerates. And some of them work in an asynchronous setting, some of them work in a synchronous setting, and some of them work in a setting of partial synchrony. The second parameter that a consensus algorithm can have, again, as the previous speaker very aptly introduced, is the failure model. There are some consensus algorithms that tolerate crash failures. It means that some of the nodes will just die and say nothing after a while. Okay? They will just stop talking. Okay? Now, this is pretty bad, but it's not the worst thing that can happen. The worst thing that can happen is known as the Byzantine failure model, in which point it's not just that the nodes that fail stop talking, they will actually say and do the worst thing, okay? Effectively, they're indistinguishable for all practical purposes from nodes that are actually controlled by an adversary that wants to actively subvert the safety and liveness properties of the protocol, okay? And these are the protocols that kind of are interesting in the context of blockchains because blockchains are open systems, and therefore, of course, they will contain adversaries. So if we can create a consensus protocol that is tolerant to Byzantine failures, it will also be tolerant to active adversaries all working together, trying to subvert the system. Then there is a question of, particularly in the consensus, does an initiator exist? Is there a particular node that is special in proposing values, and is that node honest? We will actually look at this in a second. Now, the protocol that I will describe here is our very own protocol called Blockmania. And just to characterize it, it basically ensures safety under a totally asynchronous network. So even if the network is asynchronous forever, safety will always be guaranteed. It's never going to be the case that two honest nodes end up believing something conflicting. But it only guarantees liveness, namely that they will reach a decision under partial synchrony. So we will assume that the network may be asynchronous for a long time, but eventually it will become synchronous. And that is exactly the same as the Pbft protocol from Liskov and Castro from 1999. And for good reason, it's because basically we have modified it. Okay. Now there is some very deep theory around consensus algorithms. Okay. The most important theorem is the Flp theorem that says that basically Byzantine consensus is impossible. Actually, consensus full stop, but I only care about the Byzantine consensus here, is impossible even when there is a single faulty node under full asynchrony and for a deterministic protocol. Now, this is the theorem that also motivated the previous speaker. And the previous speaker presented that theorem and then took the path of relaxing the determinism. Okay? That's really what it comes down to. We're actually going to take the other path, which is to relax asynchrony. Okay? So this theorem is correct. It's not the case that we're going to do something magical. It is just the case that here the protocols we're going to talk about are going to provide the properties of consensus under partial synchrony rather than full asynchrony. Okay? And I have already described what this partial synchrony means. Now, the second very important result is that under partial synchrony, in order for a set of nodes to reach consensus, it is the case that at least there should be a 2/3 majority of them that have not failed. Okay? So if you have basically one node that is totally malicious in a partially synchronous setting, it means that you need to have at least 3 other nodes that are honest. Okay? So one needs to be matched by 2, but then plus 1, in order to actually reach consensus safely, for the honest ones to reach consensus safely amongst each other. Okay? So all the examples that I will show you so far feature 4 nodes, because that's the minimum number beyond 1 that actually has an honest supermajority of 2/3 plus 1 nodes. Okay? So if I have F failures, I need to have 3F plus 1 nodes. And we'll see actually an example where I don't in order to get you an insight about why that is necessary. Okay, so let's have a quick look about how you actually go about building one of these consensus algorithms, one of these Byzantine consensus algorithms. Because very often in the literature, they're presented as black boxes, and that's not a very helpful way of approaching security protocols. I think we should know what's inside those and try to actually improve them as much as possible. So this is the protocol behind both Pbft, presented by Liskov and Castro in the end of the 90s, and also Blockmania, the protocol that we present as well. So in this protocol, and this is the Blockmania variant here I will go straight into rather than creating confusion by presenting 2 protocols, our aim is to determine a particular value, a block, since we're going to build a blockchain, for a particular slot that has a sequence number for a particular node. Okay? So imagine I am a node within the system, and I want to basically, well, everybody wants to determine what is the block that corresponds to me as a node for, let's say, slot 0, the first slot for which I will basically put nodes, put blocks out, okay? So in Blockmania, there is a kind of natural proposer of a block. Okay, so the idea is that there is going to be a proposer. So for example, I propose a block for a particular time slot. However, we still need a consensus algorithm that is run amongst everybody else to decide if everybody else agrees on which block I have proposed, or potentially agrees that I haven't proposed any block, okay? Because we still want finality. So this is how we proceed in order to go about this in the happy case, where there are no failures, there is nothing that goes wrong, everything is timely and synchronous and beautiful in the world. So the node that is meant to propose a block for a particular position k, let's say it's node 0, first basically enters the first phase of the protocol, which is the pre-prepare phase, and sends to all the other nodes in the protocol a pre-prepare for a particular block it is proposing. So just to give you a little bit of an insight about what is happening here, these lines represent nodes over time, and when I put an arrow between one line and the other, it means that there is a message that goes from that particular node at that particular time to another particular node at another particular time, okay? So here what we have is that this first node 0 sends a pre-prepare message with this kind of orange, proposing this orange block to all the other 3 nodes in the system. Okay, as I said, we have 4 nodes that all try to reach a joint decision. Now, what happens when a node receives a pre-prepare from the correct leader for a particular block is that what they do is, for the first pre-prepare they receive, they just basically broadcast a prepare for that same block to everybody else. Okay? So the idea is that as a node, I'm just waiting there as soon as I hear a pre-prepare for a particular block, for a particular position, for a particular sender, I just broadcast it to everybody else. If I have heard already something else for that position, I don't change my mind. I keep basically my initial belief. Okay? So eventually, all nodes will have received the pre-prepare and will have broadcast the prepare to everybody else. And then what happens that each node waits here for 2f plus 1. Remember, f is the number of failed nodes. It can only be 1 at most in this particular configuration. Since we only have 4 nodes, we cannot tolerate more faults. Okay? And when they have heard 2f plus 1 prepares for the same block, okay, they basically lock onto that block. And they say, I am ready to commit, effectively, for that particular block, for that particular decision, and broadcast a commit message with that block for this particular decision. Okay? Now, within this commit message, they have to include enough evidence that the commit is valid by actually adding all the signatures that were associated with these prepare messages for that block. And again, the previous speaker tried to get rid of the use of cryptography in these protocols. We totally embrace cryptography. I believe in cryptography. If cryptography stops ending, my life can end, and therefore I don't want to foresee a world like that. So we'll assume that digital signatures work for the purpose of this talk. Otherwise, it's a very dystopian world. So associated with this commit message, each node says, look, I have moved to commit this particular block for this particular position because I have seen these 2f plus 1 signatures that said that this is the block that people have proposed before, and therefore I'm ready to commit it. Okay. As soon as basically any node receives 2f plus 1 commits for the same block for this position, they deliver that block. So from now on, it's finalized that this is the block that they will accept for this position. Okay? And eventually, they believe that everybody else also will accept that block for that position. Everybody else, at least, who hasn't failed. Okay? Who's honest in the context of Byzantine agreements. Now, just a historic note here, and again, relating to the previous speaker, these first 2 phases here are known as Brache's reliable broadcast, effectively. So Brache's reliable broadcast ensures that all nodes at this point, eventually, if anyone basically moves to commit, everybody else eventually also moves to commit for the same block, okay, for the same message. Okay. Do we have any questions so far about what is going on? Not why. Why is actually quite a difficult question, but at least what is going on. Yes?
What is the difference between this and
Ah, in Pbft, there is no natural proposer, there is a leader instead.
Oh, but if I look at this graph, it's identical, right?
Exactly, yeah. The happy case is very happy and is the same. Yeah. So aside from that little detail, everything else so far, the same.
Second question. Pbft works with maps, which
Yes.
the assumption that Dali was making before.
Yes.
So I don't understand why you think that if signatures are taken away from you, this world collapses.
Oh no, I just don't care.
Fine.
Yeah, I just don't care.
But Castro had, Castro.
Yeah, Castro has a whole section because Castro comes from a time when signatures were expensive. Today signatures are not expensive, yeah. Yeah, I don't think that the world will collapse if cryptography stops working. It's just that it would be a mess and I don't want to go there. Yeah, because cryptography right now works, so why not use it? Yep.
Is another difference here that the commit message doesn't contain the 2F?
In Castro? It depends which variant of Castro you read, actually. So there are two variants of the protocol, one that is in his PhD thesis and one that is in the paper. One of them says they should contain them, the other one says they shouldn't contain them.
If I was to use the signatures instead of map, then I shouldn't need that.
Yeah, true. Yeah. Can't remember which variant is basically including and which variant is not including. But yeah.
If you use the right version, that the forward it prepared wouldn't be verified.
No, exactly. So it doesn't matter. You wouldn't include it there for sure. Yeah.
So what you say to F plus 1, you already include to F plus 1 prepare included in the commit. You already assume that signature is new.
Yeah, you have to. And you have to just trust the previous node for having done the right thing. So when you see a commit here, you have to basically trust the fact that because you have that many, it must indeed have been the fact that at least one of them saw enough prepares, if you don't use signatures. But let's not go into not using signatures, because frankly speaking, it is an interesting theoretical question, but for practical purposes, we will always be using signatures, because we want to do traitor tracing in reality. Okay. Any other questions about what is going on? Yes? Say it again, I can't hear. The IDs, the node IDs and everything has to be fixed, the membership has to be fixed, etc. Yes. We don't consider an open dynamic system here yet. Yeah. Everything is fixed, everybody knows everybody else, everybody knows everybody else's public keys, etc. Okay. So this is the super happy case. Okay? Now what could go wrong? I mean, let's actually first discuss what could go wrong if we violate the most basic property, namely that we can only tolerate one bad node. Okay? So let's actually see what happens if we have two bad nodes. Okay? What is the actual problem if we have two bad nodes given this protocol? So in this example here, let's violate the property and see the bad things that can happen. Both N0 and N1 are bad. So their aim in life, being bad, is that they want to confuse N2 and N3 as to what should be common decision is, and make them effectively decide two different things. So effectively, they want N2 to end in one movie, and N3 to end up in a different cinema in the other side of town, trying to watch another movie, thinking that they're going to be together. Okay? So this is how it works as a trace of an attack. What happens is that N0, whose decision is basically, in this case, says different things to N2 and N3. So it says to N2, why don't you decide green on the decision? N2, N3 here, why don't you decide blue? Okay? So they actually create a bit of a split view of the world. So they say green to N2 and blue to N3. Okay, so this is the first stage, the pre-prepare stage. So now what happens is that N2 and N3, who act honestly, start sending to each other, most importantly, the prepares for green and the prepares from blue here. However, what the bad nodes do, the malicious nodes do, is that in the second phase of prepare, what they do is they basically also present a split view, and they say to N2, both of them say to N2, prepare the green one. So now N2 has seen a pre-prepare for green. For itself, it has a prepare for green, and two other prepares from green. So basically, it's moving to commit for green. Okay? Now, N3 on the other side is shown a dark blue. So it has already a prepare for dark blue from itself because it saw the pre-prepare. It then gets more prepares from dark blue, so it now moves to actually commit dark blue. And then, of course, the bad nodes just do the same split view attack, an equivocation attack for the commit. So now what happens is that N2 has 3 commits for dark green or green. 3 commits for dark blue are available to N3. And as a result, N2 delivers green as a decision, and N3 delivers dark blue for a decision. So, boom, we've executed the protocol, and they have reached different decisions. Okay? So, the threshold of 2/3 majority plus 1 being violated is not just a little bit bad in these protocols, it is catastrophically bad. Okay? You can basically end up doing attacks like this and as an adversary. So it's not the case that somehow it's a question of degree or you lose a little bit of liveness or, you know, little bad things happen. There is a straightforward violation of safety if basically you have more than F nodes in 3F plus 1 total network size. Okay? Any questions here? Yes?
So if you consider N2 and N3, actually they can detect something quite abnormal because in the prepared round, N2 and N3 will see N0 propose 2 contradicting ideas.
Correct.
So if we have all these facts, like is there an attack which remains undetected even we have 2 levels?
So, this relates this little pink thing here, okay? Yeah. Namely, you're absolutely right. So here, let me explain what this gentleman just said, because it is genius, right? What we said is that this bad node here, N0, sends green to N2 as a pre-prepare. Now, as I described to you in the protocol, that means that now that N2 node should broadcast to all other nodes and prepare for green. Yeah? Now that means that eventually, and that's the important thing here, eventually there should be a message that goes from N2 here to N3. They're both honest nodes, so eventually there will be a message that says, hey, I think that we should decide green. Okay? And then this N3 here will say, well, wait a second, my initiator said that we should decide blue. Okay? And in fact, because we use signatures, amongst other things, they can attach the signatures to their messages, their proposers, and they can say, well, I propose here because the initiator told me green, and the initiator told you blue. Clearly, the initiator is malicious. And they will eventually detect it. However, can we afford, that's a question back to you, can we afford to wait at this point for this message to arrive here? No, we cannot. This node here now has received 3 messages. Okay, all 3 of them, in fact, say that you should go for dark blue. Can we just, well, wait a second, the quorum is 4 people. Oh, sorry, the number of nodes is 4 people, therefore I'm waiting for the 4th message, because the 4th message indeed will say there is a contradiction in the system. But they cannot wait, because they don't know if that N2 is in fact corrupt, and if they wait for N2, they will wait forever and you lose liveness. So you must, as the previous speaker said very correctly, take action after you hear 2F plus 1. If you wait for the extra message, maybe you're waiting for the adversary to do something, at which point nothing will ever happen in the system. Yeah? But you're right to say that under a synchrony assumption, if this guy knew at some point that they must hear from the honest nodes, etc., you might be able to do tracer tracing. This is what the most synchronous algorithms for doing consensus try to do. I would never use a synchronous algorithm for safety, though, because if you get it wrong, you might actually have a safety violation. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. So this is the bad kind of stuff that happens, even in the happy case. Well, it's not very happy because we have two bad nodes here, which leads to different nodes delivering things. Yes?
So following the previous questions, this means that with some probability we detect some adversary.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. Some probability sounds a very hippie statement here.
Message from the N0 arrives before you have...
Yes. No, I understand when you said with some probability what you meant. In the Byzantine consensus literature, and in an asynchronous setting, we assume that the worst thing will happen at the network level as well. So the scheduling is not just probabilistic. If you put two messages roughly at the same time, they will arrive with probability, maybe the first one, then the second one. The adversary controls your scheduling of messages. So the adversary gets to determine what comes first and what comes next. Okay? And in that sense, that's why I said that it's a little bit of a hippie statement, like with probability, blah. There are no probabilities. The adversary determines the scheduling. Now, what has to happen is that the adversary eventually will have to deliver messages from honest nodes to honest nodes, but the order is totally their discretion. Yeah? So the network is the enemy in the strongest possible sense, except that they can't drop messages. The network can't drop messages.
So this means that this is a closed network, and as you said, we know the public keys of the participants, and each eventually arrives. Eventually, in fact, always...
Eventually. But that eventually, so indeed there should be a message from here going there, but that message can arrive here. Because the adversary schedules when they will arrive. It's not like they're in slots. Don't be mistaken to think that those slots are somehow synchronous slots. So eventually the adversary will have to deliver that, but they can choose the message to arrive here after the delivery of dark blue has happened, at which point we violate finality. Yeah. Other question?
The 2/3 plus 1 majority, is that too much?
Is that?
2/3 plus 1, is that too much? I understand why you need it in this protocol, but is that too much?
Too much as in you would like it to be less, or too much as...
Too high. Like Bitcoin, right, is just the majority.
Oh, no. In Bitcoin, you also need about 2/3. This is Gunner's point, yeah. It is a often repeated thing that it's only 50% or 50% plus 1, but in fact, you also need a supermajority. I'm not actually super familiar on why. The canonical paper is by Gunner, effectively, on that. And it's very hard to actually pierce through that wall, particularly if you want finality. Bitcoin needs more than majority, but still doesn't get finality. Yeah. I can send you a reference to that. I'm not an expert on Nakamoto consensus. Okay. Now, okay, cool. So, if this protocol works, why do anything else? In particular, what I have described here is that just in these first two phases, okay, once we do a pre-prepare and we actually we have received 2f plus 1 prepares here, we know that everybody else will eventually also come to commit for the same message. Why do we need this third phase, right? That's one question that you may have in mind. So here are the kind of bad things that can happen in this protocol that are not really covered by that happy case. Okay, here I presented a happy case where everything is happy. Here are the unhappy things that can happen. Okay, so first unhappy thing that can happen is the following. As we, just reminder, the aim of this protocol is for a particular node to send a block to everybody else that will be accepted for a particular slot. So George slot 0, a particular block. But the first bad thing that can happen is that George does not ever send a block for slot 0. So if I am bad as an initiator, okay, you all will be waiting for me to send a block for a particular slot, and I will just never send anything. Okay? So that will just make the whole protocol not run so far, right? I mean, because there is no pre-propose, there is no block, there are no proposers, there are no commits, nothing will happen. Okay? So that's the first bad thing that may happen. The second bad thing that can happen is, potentially, that the initiator is bad. Now, if the initiator is bad, again, and we will actually see that case, that initial simple happy case protocol will not lead to consensus. And the third thing that can happen is that the protocol, no one's bad at that point, but the network conditions are such that we're not under any kind of period of synchrony, and therefore things become too slow, and we end up just thinking that the initiator is bad and has not sent us a block. And then the question is, what do we do under that condition? Okay? So these are the three things that can go wrong, let's say, broadly speaking, in this protocol. And therefore, just running this happy case of 3 phases of pre-prepare, prepare, and commit is not sufficient. What we need to do, a bit like Pbft before us, is to actually have a way of making progress if the protocol gets stuck. So let's look at a particular instance of the protocol getting stuck. And the most exciting instance, in my view, is when we have an initiator here that is bad. So we already covered the case where we have 2 nodes that are bad. And we have already shown that this is devastating. We cannot protect against that. But what happens if just 1 node is bad? In theory, we should be able to tolerate that. As we said, Byzantine fault-tolerant protocols should be able to tolerate 1 node being bad. Okay? But what happens here? Let's actually go through this trace and see how it ends up. So N0 is bad, and therefore when it comes to sending a pre-prepare for a particular position, okay, what they do is they do again a split view attack. They send green as a pre-prepare to node N1. Okay, so they say, oh, prepare green for me. But to node N2 and N3, they present dark blue. Okay? So now, the 3 honest nodes here, N1, N2, and N3, start sending prepares to each other for different decisions. Okay, so we have here 2 of them that send prepares for dark blue, and 2 of them, including the bad node, that, let's say, send prepares for dark green. Now, your insight, by the way, starts becoming relevant again. Something has clearly gone wrong, okay? And in fact, here something has gone wrong, and eventually, everybody will know that something has gone wrong. And the reason for that is that what happens is that all honest nodes will ever receive 2 messages for dark blue, 2 prepares for dark blue, and at most 2 prepares for dark green. That will never make the threshold of 2f plus 1, which is 3, by the way. Okay? And therefore, the protocol is stuck and blocked there forever. Now, eventually, they will discover that something has gone wrong, okay? Because they start receiving contradictory messages for the same decision, the same kind of phase. But then the question is, what do they do, right? I mean, it's not really clear. Okay. So basically, at some point here, if we just follow this happy path protocol, we stop making progress, and our liveness just suffers. Okay? Any questions so far about what is the problem here? Okay? The problem is we will never receive 2f plus 1 equals 3 messages here, because we at most will have 2 messages of each color. There is no 3 messages of any particular color. So what do we do? Yes?
In this particular example, that was a bad node, so you forget. So you could just totally drop it. You could just forget that you had it.
Forget that we had what, though?
You can just forget that you are at that block phase.
Ah, but we need a decision. We still need a decision. But you're right.
You put it in another file, and you go on with other files.
We will do that eventually, yes. That's where we're going here, right? give me a second, and then you can come back to me with a concrete thing. So the Pbft protocol, as well as our protocol, at that point allows nodes to just time out, okay? And this is where the synchrony assumption comes in the partial synchrony, okay? So far, I never mentioned the word timeout. Every time you hear time, that means there is a synchrony assumption. So for liveness, we allow the nodes to time out. That means what? That means that if a node feels that they have stopped making sufficient progress, and this is really quite discretionary at some level, then what happens is they can trigger what is known as a view change. They can say, you know what? I have been here for too long, I feel, as a node. Either I have been receiving contradictory stuff, or I just haven't received enough stuff for the period that I feel I should be receiving stuff, or whatever. I'm just not making any progress here, guys. So what I will do is I will say, let's start again. And this is basically, instead of saying let's forget that round, it's more like, let's start again. Let's try again to make a decision on this particular block, okay? However, there is something very important in view change protocols, both for Pbft and also for Blockmania, which is the following. That if there was any possibility that any node in the previous phase, in the previous view as it's called, may have reached a conclusion that they should have delivered a particular node, then it must be the case that that decision is carried forward as well. And as I usually say, this promises have to be kept. So if at any point in this particular view 0, this first try of the protocol, it might be the case that any honest node could have delivered a particular color, either blue or green or whatever, okay? It must be the case that when we move to another view, potentially, the same decision is actually reached. Why? Because otherwise this node, a particular node could have delivered, and then if the decision is changed, it means that something else happens, and then we don't have consensus anymore, okay? So promises have to be kept. So there is a particular complexity in designing this view change protocol so that when you actually move to say, I would like to change view, I would like to try again a run of this protocol, you include enough evidence in your view change that ensures that anyone else who sees the view change and may actually start initiating the protocol again carries enough information and will reach the same decision, okay? In practice, on view change, what basically Pbft does is it carries all of the commits, all of the prepares that may have led to a commit here. So that's quite a bit of information here. And then what happens is that nodes, when they see 2f+1 view changes, move to a new view, which means that you broadcast new view, and then that initiates a second round, second view of the protocol. Okay, so effectively after that, you pretend that this new view was a pre-prepare for a particular value, and you start preparing, etc. Now, in Pbft, this kind of new view and view change set of the protocols is very complex, okay? Because it tries to do a lot about preserving a previous sequence of events, etc. Because here we only try to work out a single decision, what we have done in Blockmania is we have radically simplified it. And actually we follow very much your insight, if you want. We say that, look, if there is enough evidence here for anyone to actually having moved to commit, we will of course commit the same block and try to decide the same block in the new view as well. But if there wasn't actually any decision, because for example there is a split view attack or anything like that, we will move to actually change the view to decide that there was no block decided for this particular run of the protocol, okay? So a protocol can lead to a particular block that everybody agrees, or there was no block. And let's all move to agree that there was no block. There is no point agonizing about making a decision. Let's just all decide there was nothing there, it's empty. Let's say it never happened, but we all need to decide that, okay? Now, I will not go entirely into the details of how we do that. You can look at our paper in order to convince yourself that we can actually do this. Okay, so just as a summary, particularly since someone was interested about what are the differences between Pbft and Blockmania, in traditional Pbft, we have a leader that keeps trying to make many decisions, and then that's a sequence of decisions, etc. In Blockmania, we don't actually have a special leader to move all the views. What we have is we have a proposer, because we try to make a decision for a particular round. But then if we move to another view, we don't have to keep electing leaders. Anyone can actually act as a leader. And let's just leave it at that for the moment. Now, yes, please.
Is there a proof of safety and liveness of the
Informally, yeah. Don't expect a formal proof. If you'd like to give me a formal proof, I would love it. We're working on it. We're working on it. Yes? Yes. There is no new leader. Yeah. Very, very good point. Let me. Okay. Since you're curious, I'd rather not cover Blockmania and actually make you happy than cover. Okay. Cool. So here is what's going on here. So at some point, one of the honest nodes will receive 2f+1 view change messages. Yeah. Now those 2f+1 view change messages will contain potentially enough prepairs here to say that someone has potentially moved to commit messages there or not. Okay? Now, if even a single one of these view change messages out of the 2f+1 contains 2t+1 prepairs, it means that eventually all the other ones potentially will also have received the prepair, so we need to actually propose the same value. Yes? So far, so good. But it is also possible that none of them do. Yeah? So far, so good? Good. So now what happens is that the first one, and this is an ambivalent statement in the distributed system, who's the first one? The first, as soon as basically any node here receives 2f+1 view changes, they broadcast to everybody else new view. And they broadcast new view, of course, for the value that they received either before to keep the promise, or no block if there is no such possible value. So now two things could happen. It may happen that any such node that sends a new view, that broadcasts a new view, that all of them propose no block, because genuinely there was no other message here that could have been decided. It might be that all of them propose a particular block, and it will have to be a particular block here that everybody else would have agreed on. Or it may be the case, and this is the tricky case, where some of them, okay, say, well, the set of 2f+1 messages says no block, and some of them happen to include that one extra message that actually had a potential commit, okay, and therefore have to propose the previous message. At which point, okay, what you will end up here is the same case as we had originally here, where we have effectively something like a leader that proposes two things. One is a no block, and the other one is the one message that potentially could have been decided in the previous round. And then what we would have to do is we would have to repeat effectively another round of this. They would get potentially blocked, and we would move to view 2. So safety is preserved, okay? And for liveness, we will have to try again.
Couldn't the determine approach is a little bit simpler at this point? Say, if at the timeout there's no rich as there's no consensus at the timeout of timeout, and anyone wants to throw away that, and the view either is elected is around moving away and has absolute power to close and block.
Yeah. So in Tendermint, they rotate the leader, right? I don't want to have a leader. For various reasons, I don't want to have a leader, and I can tell you in a second why I don't want to have a leader.
There's no with the percent anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, so here effectively it would be, okay, we will only accept a new view from a particular other, rather than competing new views. I don't want to have that, and I will explain why in a second if you want. Yeah. Okay. The questions beget questions. I love it.
Just a simple question. So this is for permission setting.
Yes.
Do you have any plan or?
No. I'm not going to talk today about permission stuff. No. Too much. Already that's too much. Yeah. Yes, because you just move to no block. As yeah.
So what is the catch? Is that no checkouts always?
Okay. So what we have done here is we have removed effectively the role of the leader, etc., etc. So that allows us to do a bunch of things that are interesting. Any other questions though on that slide before I move to the other bunch of things that is interesting? Yeah? No? Okay. Cool. Okay. So Pbft Blockmania, fine. So now, so far I have proposed a protocol that allows you to make a decision for a particular participant for a particular position to decide a block, right? But that doesn't lead to a global consensus, right? That doesn't lead to a sequence of events that everybody will agree. However, what you can do is you can say, okay, for each node in my system, what we will do is we will propose a block for each particular position. So for conceptually, position 0, we will basically propose, each node will propose and we will agree on a particular block. And then for 1, we will each basically agree on a particular block. Potentially no block will be decided for some of them. Then for the second, or the third round actually, we will propose some blocks. Then for the fourth round, we will basically agree on some blocks, etc. And once everybody has reached agreement on the full set of blocks, you just take all the transactions in there, you apply any deterministic ordering function, and you have a total order, okay? So if you actually have a primitive that allows you to decide for each particular node for a position, so for node 0, position 1, let's all agree on a particular block, you can bootstrap from there to get consensus for all nodes across all blocks and all positions. Okay. So now, the reason we did these simplifications has to do with how we actually go then about implementing this protocol. And I only have 8 minutes to go through this, but I want to give you at least an insight. So what is the problem with implementing Pbft type protocols? Who has actually tried to implement one of those? Okay, so you know the horror. You know the horror? Okay. So what is the horror? The horror is that when you try to implement a Pbft protocol, you're mixing two things. You're mixing code that has to do with networking, okay? So that takes messages off a network and puts messages into the network. Now, that code is usually asynchronous, okay? And you're mixing code that at the same time has to be very correct and preserve the invariance of the Pbft state machine, effectively, what happens when you receive messages and send messages, okay? Now, all the pressures when you write networking code is to make extremely fast networking code, okay, with all the hacks and the optimizations that you can do. All the pressures when you actually try to maintain the invariance of the Pbft machinery is to make sure that it's bloody correct. So you try to, do that as defensively as possible. The two pressures pull you different ways, okay? Pretty much. The second problem with implementing a Pbft state machine, as I described on commit, view change, and new view, you need to add a lot of evidence to messages to prove to everybody else that you did the right thing. So when you say I'm moving to commit something, potentially you want to include some prepare messages to prove that you did the right thing. When you say I would like to move to a new view, you need to include in the new view message or the view change message enough evidence about previous commits in order to convince everybody you're doing the right thing. And when effectively you move to a new view again, you have to include enough view change messages to convince everybody else that you did the right thing. So every time you send a message to each other in a naive implementation, you need to include a lot of previous messages to convince other people that you're doing the right thing. Okay? So that's the second problem. And then potentially, particularly given the description of the protocol I have given so far, what you have to do is you have to run separate 3-round protocols for each decision you're going to make. Okay? Now, of course, traditional Pbft says, okay, we can do some batching, etc., but effectively you have to keep doing this 3-round protocol, separate 3-round protocols for each decision. Now, I have actually tried to implement Pbft state machines directly. I found it to be a nightmare. How do you guys find it? Did you enjoy your experience? Not really. No one enjoyed that experience. In fact, I know that no one enjoys that experience because there is no high-quality free software implementation of Pbft. Every time people will say, let's use Pbft, they say, why don't you use the crappy C++ code from 1998 from, you know, Castro, okay? There is actually no implementation of Pbft out there. Oh yeah, the smart BFT code. Yeah, the one that has no unit tests, no nothing. Yeah, I've used that, thank you. Yeah, I've used it. That's actually what we used to evaluate Chainsapce originally. No thanks. Bless them for trying though. Okay, so this is why we did the modifications to Pbft into Blockmania, in order to enable the following architecture. So what we really would like to do, as an implementer, what I would really like to do, is to be able to separate as much as possible all the I/O and networking code from all of my state machine Pbft code. Okay, if I could totally separate those two, I would be a happy person, because what I could do is I could just make extremely fast, but it has to be simple, I/O related operations, and then I could actually do something that does not involve asynchronous programming to interpret effectively whatever is given to me as a structure by my I/O code in order to reach consensus. So effectively, ideally speaking, I would like to have the following kind of architecture. This is an architecture diagram. What I would like to have is to have the 4 nodes, 4 or however many nodes you have to do consensus, that run a joint protocol that just create a causal graph of blocks that nodes have exchanged with each other. Okay, so the idea, you know, that just describes what has each person seen from each other. Okay, now generating that graph is quite simple in comparison to doing full consensus. Okay, this is just a graph that says, I received that message from other people, I'm sending that message to other people. They basically just create that causal graph of messages exchanged. And then I would like to take that causal graph and put it basically through a layer that effectively just creates finality, that interprets all this pattern of communication as some kind of consensus protocol, and then just outputs effectively a list of decisions. And this log of actions and log of commands. Okay, so architecturally, this is what I would ideally like to do. Okay, and this is what and how we implement Blockmania in practice. We don't implement the protocol that I actually have shown you. Okay, what we do instead is the following. First of all, we have our nodes have a front-end networking core. What is this networking core doing? It's actually doing something very simple. A node waits on clients to send transactions, so it receives transactions from many clients, and then it also listens from other nodes that are in the consensus protocol that are sending blocks to that node. And then what it does is it just creates a hash chain forward that contains a list of transactions, a list of other blocks in the order in which the transactions, the blocks were received, and hashes of those, a hash of the previous block, and it signs all this. And then it sends and broadcasts those blocks periodically to everybody else. Okay? So effectively, as a node performing Blockmania, all my networking operations are very simple. I just listen to messages, blocks or transactions from other people, hash them periodically into blocks, broadcast the blocks to everybody else. Okay, very simple. I don't need to do Pbft, I don't need to do invariants, I don't need to do any state machines or anything like that. As a result of all this, each node now creates a transcript of effectively this block-directed acyclic graph of communications that it receives from everyone else, okay? And then what we do is we pass on this structure, we pass on this graph to the next layer, that does the finality, that doesn't do any networking anymore. And now what this layer does is, it effectively, in the head of the node interpreting this graph, interprets that pattern of communication as instances of the abstract simplified Pbft protocol that I have described. Let me give you an example. So when basically someone sees that particular directed acyclic graph of nodes, now you may think that this looks very much and very similar to the protocol I showed before, but it isn't at all. What that says is that, look, node N0 has a particular block here. That block was included in those 3 blocks, and that block as well. That block was included in that block, etc. But this pattern of blocks being included in other blocks can be interpreted as saying, this particular node at 0 proposed this particular orange block for position k. As soon as this is transmitted to all others, we interpret this as basically a pre-prepare that goes from here to those. So now those start state machines for Blockmania that say, I have prepared effectively this block for this orange block for this position for this node. Now, as soon as that block that contains this prepare is included in the other blocks, that can be interpreted as them saying, let's commit all this, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So to be able to actually implement the algorithm like this, just by looking at the DAG and interpreting the DAG as instances of this simplified Pbft protocol, what I absolutely need is to make sure that there is no discretion, that it's totally deterministic. It's totally deterministic, and there is no discretion in a leader, so that the leader cannot actually take decisions about which out of, let's say, F messages or 2F+1 or whatever messages I'm choosing to run the protocol. Now, as a result of that separation between the networking and the interpretation, and also as a result of us being able to pipeline and interpret parts of these blocks as different instances in parallel of making decision on particular position and particular graphs, we end up having extremely high performance. Because we can optimize to the maximum of front end that does something very simple. It just basically exchanges DAGs of graphs. And we can just write code that is absolutely not asynchronous for interpreting that DAG in order to effectively reach consensus. And we're hitting performances, not doing any smart contracts, and not checking any signatures, on the transaction or anything like that, in the order of magnitude of 400,000 to 500,000 transactions a second. Now, this is perfect conditions, right? This is the Google network across continents, but still 16 machines on the Google network, 100 byte transactions, etc. This is kind of order of magnitude larger than what was reported by the smart BFT people, who say they do about 50,000 transactions a second. And it really has to do with the fact that the bottleneck for Pbft protocols is networking, and the networking front ends we have are so simple that we can really optimize the hell out of them, okay? And the interpretation of the graph down the line is computationally somewhat expensive, but there is nothing that interjects that computation and that correctness in the middle of the protocol and the networking layer. Okay, so the separation between the two allows us to actually hit that performance. Now, something very interesting is that from a theoretical point of view, okay, the communication complexity of this protocol that I have presented is about O(n) squared in the number of nodes. Now, O(n) squared is pretty bad, right? Because if you think about it, O(n) squared means that if I have 10 machines, I have in the order of magnitude of 100 times the cost and stuff like that. However, it is worthwhile noting that this O(n) squared really refers to numbers of hashes exchanged in the whole network. And hashes are very small. Hashes are 20 bytes, okay? So even though it is O(n) squared for small quorums of tens to 100 nodes, let's say, not thousands or tens of thousands, in practice, in comparison with the volume of transactions that are in the actual block it doesn't really matter. And as a result, we see hardly any performance degradation. In fact, actually, due to noise, we actually see a performance increase on average between having quorums that are quite small, of f equals 2, 10 nodes, or 16 nodes, etc. Because the actual cost in front of this n squared here is just 20 bytes, and that's totally disappearing in comparison with the block size. Yes? What the latency that we have set in order to do these measurements is 1 second per block, which means that happy path we get 4 seconds. Yeah. Okay, so this is the measurements we have done, and even in theory, actually, for small quorums, it doesn't really matter. Okay, cool. So I will actually stop here. There is no point in actually running over time. Come and talk to me later if you want to know more about how to then take kind of fast and performant consensus algorithms and then move to beyond even being able to do 500,000 transactions a second. There are many more topics around Blockmania that some of them are covered in the paper and some of them are not covered in the paper. How to actually do clock sync in a Byzantine way to facilitate partial synchrony is an interesting question. How to actually set the timeouts to encourage partial synchrony is another interesting topic. How can we actually have an ON variant of Blockmania rather than ON squared is an interesting topic, and you're free to think about it. What if we don't actually need consensus? What if we just need reliable broadcast? As the previous speaker said, that's actually also an interesting primitive. Can we still implement it using this trick of separating networking from the actual interpretation? And we have ideas there. Other statistical variants, that's another interesting one. And how do we integrate, to your point, all of this with a proof of stake mechanism to have an open system is also an interesting question. But those I will discuss with you offline in the next hour or two if you want. I won't proceed. Thank you very much.